Snow had not stopped falling on the Breck homestead for 9 days straight, and by the 10th morning, Lenora Breck had counted what remained of her family's life in small, terrible numbers. 4 handfuls of dried beans, a quarter wheel of cheese gone hard as stone, 1 tin of lard, and 2 children, 11-year-old Micah and 8-year-old Josie, watching her from the bed with the kind of quiet that only hungry children know how to keep. The winter of 1877 had come early to the Bitterroot Valley of Montana Territory, rolling down from the Sapphire Mountains like a white funeral shroud, and it had no intention of leaving. Lenora pressed her forehead against the frozen cabin wall and shut her eyes. She was 26 years old. Her hands, once nimble enough to stitch lace collars for the ladies' shop in Helena, were now split open at the knuckles, raw from hauling water and splitting what little kindling she could manage. Her husband Owen had been dead 5 months. 5 months since the morning he rode out to check the timberline and came back draped across his horse with a broken neck. That was the official story, anyway. A logging accident, they said. The horse spooked, they said. Lenora had buried him in the rocky soil behind the cabin and hadn't believed a word of it since. Mama. Josie's voice came thin and papery from beneath the quilts. My stomach hurts. I know, little bird. I'm going to fix that right now. She wasn't. There was nothing to fix it with. But a mother's lie is a particular kind of currency on the frontier. It buys another hour, another morning, another reason for a child to stay brave. Lenora pulled on Owen's old elk-hide coat, the sleeves hanging past her fingertips, and shoved her feet into boots she'd lined with cattail fluff to keep her toes from going black. She grabbed the hatchet from beside the door and stepped outside into the blinding white silence. The cold didn't hit her, it swallowed her. The air was so sharp it felt like breathing broken glass. Lenora squinted against the glare, scanning the tree line for deadfall she could drag back. The snow was waist deep in places, and every step was a negotiation between her body and the earth's refusal to let her pass. She had made it perhaps 40 yards toward the creek when she saw the dark shape. At first she thought it was a fallen elk. A mound of brown and black half buried in a drift near the frozen water line, steam rising faintly from it like the last breath of a dying campfire. But elk don't wear boots, and elk don't leave a trail of red behind them in the snow. Lenora tightened her grip on the hatchet. Every nerve in her body told her to turn around. The Bitterroot was crawling with desperate men. Claim jumpers, army deserters, whiskey traders who'd cut a woman's throat for a warm cabin. She took a step backward. Then the shape moved. A hand. Enormous, knuckles torn raw. Clawed at the snow. A sound came from beneath the fur-lined coat. Something between a groan and a prayer, and it was so full of animal suffering that it stopped Lenora where she stood. She moved closer, the hatchet raised. She nudged the body with her boot. The man rolled slightly, and she saw his face. He was maybe 35, with a heavy jaw darkened by a week's growth of beard, deep-set eyes shut tight against the pain, and a nose that had been broken more than once. His wool shirt was soaked through with blood. Not old blood, not dried, but fresh, bright, still seeping from a wound somewhere beneath the heavy buffalo hide coat draped across his chest. Strapped across his back was a long canvas roll, and clutched against his ribs with both arms was a leather document case, gripped so fiercely that his fingers had gone white. His lips moved. Lenora leaned down. The papers, he rasped. Don't let... Keller. The name hit her like a slap. Ambrose Keller. The timber baron who controlled every sawmill, every logging crew, and every square foot of merchantable forest in the Bitterroot Valley. The same man who had ridden to her cabin 3 weeks after Owen's funeral with a bottle of port wine and a document he claimed was a lien against her property. Sign it over, Mrs. Breck, he'd said, smiling with teeth that looked like they'd been filed to fit that smile. A woman alone out here. It's no life for those children. Lenora stared down at the bleeding stranger. She thought about the 4 handfuls of beans and the 2 children in the bed and the absolute stupidity of dragging a dying man into a cabin that was already a coffin. She thought about Owen, about how he used to say that the measure of a person wasn't taken in comfort, but in crisis. God forgive me if this kills us, Lenora muttered. She dropped the hatchet, grabbed the collar of his buffalo coat with both hands, and pulled. He was enormous. She guessed 200 pounds, maybe more, and the snow fought her for every inch. She dragged him on her heels, her spine screaming, her breath coming in ragged white bursts. The 40 yards back to the cabin took her the better part of an hour. Twice she fell. Twice she got up, her legs shaking so badly she had to lock her knees to stay standing. When she finally reached the porch, she couldn't feel her hands. "Micah!" she screamed. "Open the door, now!" The door swung wide. Micah stood there in his father's oversized flannel shirt, his face going chalk white at the sight. Behind him, Josie let out a thin, keening cry. "Help me," Lenora gasped. "Grab his feet. Pull." The boy obeyed without a word. Together, the gaunt widow and her 11-year-old son, they hauled the stranger over the threshold and onto the plank floor in front of the cold stove. Lenora kicked the door shut, slammed the iron bolt, and stood there panting, her back against the wood, blood smeared across Owen's elk-hide coat. The cabin smelled of iron and snow and sweat. Lenora knelt beside the man, peeling back the buffalo coat with shaking hands. Beneath it, his wool shirt was slashed open across the left side of his torso, and a deep, ugly wound gaped from his ribs to his hip. Not a bullet hole, but a knife wound, long and deliberate, the kind of cut meant to open a man up and leave him to bleed out slow. "Micah, I need the stove lit. Use the last of the birch bark. Get water boiling." She didn't look up. "Josie, bring me the sewing box, the one with the curved needles." "Mama, is he going to die?" Josie whispered. "Not today, he isn't." For the next 2 hours, Lenora stitched the stranger's flesh together by candlelight while her children huddled on the bed and tried not to listen to the sounds. She had sutured Owen's arm once after a saw kicked back on him, and she had sewn up a mule's leg after a cougar attack, but she had never closed a wound this deep on a man she didn't know. She poured the last of Owen's rye whiskey into the cut. The stranger's body arched off the floor, a roar tearing out of him that shook dust from the rafters. Micah clamped his hands over Josie's ears. "Hold still," Lenora said through gritted teeth, pressing her knee against his chest. "Hold still, or I'll let you bleed." She worked the needle through the ragged edges of skin, pulling the catgut tight, tying it off, moving to the next stitch. By the time she finished, her fingers were cramped into claws and the front of her dress was soaked with his blood. She packed the wound with clean rags torn from her last good bedsheet, bound his ribs tight, and sat back on the floor, staring at the ceiling. The fever came that night. The stranger burned so hot that Lenora could feel the heat radiating off him from 2 feet away. He thrashed on the floor, muttering through cracked lips, his words tumbling out in fragments that made Lenora's blood run cold. Keller's men, the timber deed, survey markers moved. All of it, rigged. She pressed a cold cloth to his forehead and listened. The accident wasn't an accident. The cable, they cut it. Lenora's hand went still. The logging cable. Owen had been working near a cable-rigged skid line the day he died. The official story was that a spooked horse had pulled the cable loose, but if someone had cut it deliberately, if the cable had snapped and whipped across the trail, it would have taken a man clean off his horse. Her hands began to tremble, and this time it had nothing to do with the cold. She reached for the leather document case the stranger had been clutching. Inside, she found a journal bound in oilcloth, a folded territorial survey map covered in handwritten annotations, and a bundle of letters tied with twine. The journal's front page read, "Property of Duncan Farrow, Territorial Land Surveyor, appointed by Governor Potts, Helena." Duncan Farrow. She had heard the name once, months ago, when Owen came home from the general store in Derby looking troubled. He'd mentioned a surveyor the territorial government had sent to verify timber claims and property boundaries in the valley. Owen said the man was honest, which in the Bitterroot in 1877 was roughly as common as finding gold in your wash basin. Lenora opened the map. Her breath caught. Someone, Duncan, presumably, had marked dozens of boundary lines in red ink, with notes in a tight, precise hand. Keller's eastern claims. Fraudulent. Survey markers relocated 400 yards west. Original Breck parcel extends to ridgeline, not creek as Keller's filing state. She flipped through the journal. Page after page documented Ambrose Keller's systematic theft of public land. He had been moving survey markers, bribing the county recorder, and filing false claims for years. Every small homesteader in the valley, including Owen, had been robbed of timber rights worth thousands of dollars. And according to Duncan's notes, the territorial governor had authorized a federal investigation based on his preliminary findings. Keller had discovered that Duncan was coming and set men to make sure his report never reached Helena. A large, rough hand clamped around Lenora's wrist. She gasped. Duncan Farrow's eyes were open, gray-green, bright with fever, wild with instinct. His other hand shot to his belt, searching for a weapon that wasn't there. "Who are you?" he growled. "I'm the woman who just sewed you back together with a darning needle," Lenora said, keeping her voice level despite the hammering in her chest. "You're in my cabin. I found you in the snow by the creek. You're safe." His eyes swept the room. The patched walls, the cold stove, the two pale children watching from the bed, the bloody rags on the floor. His grip loosened. "Your name," he said. "Lenora Breck." Something shifted in his face. Breck. Owen Breck's wife? Owen Breck's widow? Duncan closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the wildness was gone, replaced by something heavy and sad. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Breck. I'm sorry about your husband. I documented his claim. His property line was moved." Keller took 40 acres of prime timber from him with a stroke of a pen. "I know," Lenora said quietly, placing the journal back in the case. "I just read it." She paused. "Your notes say the logging cable that killed Owen might not have been an accident." Duncan didn't look away. "It wasn't. Keller's foreman, a man named Cleet Dunbar, is the one who gave the order. 2 of Keller's loggers saw it happen. I have their sworn depositions in that case. That's why Keller wants me dead." Lenora sat very still. The fire in the stove had died to embers. In the bed, Josie had fallen asleep against her brother's shoulder, and Micah stared at the stranger with eyes that were too old for 11. "How many men did Keller send after you?" Lenora asked. 3. 2 caught me on the ridge trail 3 miles north. I killed one. The other put this in me." He touched his bandaged side. "Third one is still out there. Man named Sutter. He won't quit." "Then you need to heal fast, Mr. Farrell. I need to get this case to Helena. You need to not die on my floor first." Lenora stood, her joints cracking. "Micah, put the last of the beans on. We're feeding 4 tonight." For 3 days the storm pinned them inside the cabin. Duncan Farrow fought the fever like a man wrestling something with teeth. Lenora barely slept, changing his dressings, spooning broth between his cracked lips, bathing his face with snow water. By the 2nd day, the fever broke. By the 3rd, he was sitting upright against the wall, pale and drawn but alert, watching the family with a quiet attentiveness that reminded Lenora painfully of Owen. It was Josie who thawed first. On the 3rd afternoon, she crept across the floor to where Duncan sat and placed her cornhusk doll on his knee. "Her name is Marigold," Josie said solemnly. "She's sick too. Can you hold her while she gets better?" Duncan looked down at the small, battered doll, then at the serious face of the little girl. Something cracked behind his eyes. Some wall built from years of sleeping alone in mountain camps and talking to nobody but his horse. "I'd be honored, Miss Josie," he said quietly. He cradled the doll with absurd gentleness in his massive hands, and Josie smiled. A real smile, the kind Lenora hadn't seen on her daughter's face in 5 months. That evening, Micah was struggling to repair a broken leather strap on the cabin door, his small fingers fumbling with a blunt awl. Duncan watched for a moment, then cleared his throat. "Come here, son. You're going to punch clean through your thumb working it that way." He showed the boy how to brace the leather against a block of wood, how to angle the awl so it pierced without splitting. His voice was patient, unhurried, and Micah leaned in close, absorbing every word. By the time they'd finished, the strap was repaired and Micah was asking about elk tracking. "Your father taught you how to work hard," Duncan told him. "That's the best thing a man can pass down." Micah's chin trembled. He nodded once and went to bed without a word. After the children were asleep, Lenora and Duncan sat on opposite sides of the stove, the orange light painting their faces. The wind moaned outside. "You read the journal," Duncan said. "Not a question. I did. I had to know if whoever did that to you was going to come through my door next. Keller is buying up every homestead in this valley. Your land sits on the best stand of old-growth ponderosa pine between here and Missoula. The Northern Pacific Railroad has been negotiating with the territory for timber contracts to build rail ties west. Whoever controls the timber controls the railroad's money. Keller has been forging claims, moving boundaries, and when people don't sell..." He trailed off. "Owen wasn't the first." The silence that followed was thick enough to touch. "What will happen if your documents reach Helena?" Lenora asked. "Keller goes to federal prison. Every false claim gets reversed. Every homesteader in this valley gets back what was stolen." He looked at her. "Including you, Lenora. Owen's parcel includes 40 acres of prime timber. At current railroad prices, that's worth more money than you've seen in your life." Lenora stared into the dying coals. "I don't care about the money. I care about the truth. I want to know that Owen didn't die for nothing." "He didn't," Duncan said. "Owen refused to sell. That made him dangerous. Keller had to remove him." "Then we make sure Keller pays for it." On the fourth morning, the sky cleared. The sun broke over the Sapphire Range and turned the valley into a blinding field of diamonds. Lenora stepped outside and filled her lungs with air so cold and clean it made her dizzy. For a moment, just a moment, the world was beautiful. Duncan limped out behind her, leaning heavily on a pine staff Micah had cut for him. He was gaunt, his face hollowed by fever and blood loss, but his eyes were sharp and scanning the tree line with the instinct of a man who had lived his life in wild country. "I can make it to the creek," he said. "If there's fish under the ice, I can get them. You can barely stand. I can stand well enough to cut a hole and drop a line." He was gone for 2 hours. Lenora paced the cabin, watching the tree line through the window, her stomach knotted. When the door finally opened, Duncan stood there with 4 fat cutthroat trout strung on a willow branch, swaying on his feet, fresh blood seeping through his bandage. "You tore your stitches," Lenora said. "Fish is on the menu, Mrs. Breck." He collapsed into the chair by the stove, and Josie clapped her hands at the sight of the trout, and Micah grinned for the first time in weeks, and Lenora turned to the stove to gut the fish so nobody would see her cry. Over the next week, something shifted in the cabin. The trout and a rabbit Duncan managed to snare restored strength and warmth. Color returned to the children's cheeks. Lenora found herself humming while she cooked, an old hymn her mother used to sing in the kitchen back in Pennsylvania. She caught herself and stopped, embarrassed, but Duncan looked up from the map he was annotating and said, "Don't stop. It's the first music this cabin's heard in a long time, I'd wager." They talked in the evenings after the children slept. He told her about the mountain passes in winter, the way the elk moved through the valleys like rivers of brown, the silence at 12,000 feet where the only sound was your own heartbeat. She told him about Owen, about the life they'd planned, about the piano she'd left behind in Pennsylvania because there was no room in the wagon. He listened the way few men did, not waiting for his turn to talk, but actually hearing her. She noticed things. The way he always made sure Josie got the biggest piece of fish. The way he checked the door bolt 3 times before sleeping. The way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't watching, not with hunger but with a kind of bewildered reverence, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. On the 11th day, the peace shattered. Duncan was on the porch, splitting firewood one-handed, his wounded side still too tender for a full swing. Lenora was inside, teaching Josie her letters on a slate board. The rhythmic crack of the axe stopped. Lenora looked up. Through the window she saw Duncan standing perfectly still, the axe frozen at his side, his head tilted to the south. She opened the door. "Duncan, get the children underground," he said. His voice was flat and cold, a voice she hadn't heard from him before. Right now, Lenora. She heard it then. The crunch of hooves on frozen ground. Coming from the south trail, more than one horse. Lenora didn't hesitate. She swept Josie off the bench, grabbed Micah's arm, and hauled the trapdoor open in the floor. The root cellar was dark and smelled of cold earth and onion skins. "Down, both of you. Do not make a sound. Do not come up until I tell you." "Mama." Micah started. "Now, Micah." They went. Lenora dropped the trapdoor, kicked the rag rug over it, and pulled Owen's Winchester repeater from the pegs above the fireplace. She checked the chamber, 7 rounds, and grabbed a box of cartridges from the high shelf. Her hands were steady. Some part of her had been waiting for this since the day Owen died. Outside, Duncan had moved to the side of the porch, his Colt revolver drawn. He had retrieved it from his saddlebag days earlier, and he held it now with the ease of a man who had carried one most of his life. 6 riders came up the trail. Ambrose Keller rode at the center on a tall black gelding, dressed in a long wool overcoat with a beaver fur collar that probably cost more than Lenora's entire homestead. His face was narrow, clean-shaven, and carefully arranged into an expression of neighborly concern that fooled nobody. Flanking him were 5 men. Lenora recognized Cleety Dunbar, Keller's foreman, a thick-necked man with small, flat eyes, and a lean, scarred rider she guessed was the one called Sutter. The other 3 were strangers, hired muscle with rifles across their saddle horns. "Mrs. Barbering Pin, Breck," Keller called out, his voice carrying across the clearing with practiced warmth. "Terrible winter we're having. I wanted to check on you and the children. Make sure you're getting along." Lenora stepped onto the porch, the Winchester held low against her hip. "You're not welcome here, Mr. Bra. Keller, you know that." Keller's eyes moved past her to the porch, where the fresh-cut firewood was stacked higher than a lone woman and 2 children could manage. His gaze hardened. "I see you've had help. That's wonderful. A woman in your situation needs all the help she can get." His eyes locked onto something. Duncan's heavy buffalo coat hanging on the porch rail, unmistakable in its size. "That's a big coat for a small family." Duncan Farrow stepped into view. The reaction was immediate. Dunbar's hand dropped to his holster. Sutter's horse shifted as its rider tensed. Keller's composed mask splintered. His mouth opened, then closed. He had paid 3 men good money to make sure Duncan Farrow bled out on a mountain trail. "Morning, Ambrose," Duncan said. His voice was calm, almost conversational, but his eyes were locked on Keller the way a wolf locks on a lame deer. "You look surprised." "Kill him," Keller said. No preamble, no pretense. The words came out flat and quick, like a man swatting a fly. "Kill them both. Burn it." Sutter was fast. His rifle came up and Duncan shoved Lenora sideways through the cabin door, a bullet splintering the door frame an inch from her head. Duncan dropped behind the water barrel and fired twice. The first shot took one of the unnamed riders through the shoulder, spinning him out of his saddle. The second punched into the snow at Sutter's horse's hooves, sending the animal into a rearing panic. Lenora hit the cabin floor, rolled, and came up in a crouch beneath the front window. Glass shattered above her as a volley of rifle fire tore through the cabin. Splinters rained down. She heard Josie scream beneath the floor and prayed the children would stay down. She rose to the shattered window, shouldered the Winchester, and sighted down the barrel. Cleet Dunbar had dismounted and was moving toward the side of the cabin, trying to flank them. Lenora tracked him. Her finger found the trigger. She thought of Owen. She thought of the cable snapping. She thought of Dunbar giving that order. She fired. The Winchester kicked hard against her shoulder. Dunbar staggered, grabbing his thigh, and went down behind the woodpile with a howl of pain. He wasn't dead, but he wasn't flanking anyone. "Sides clear," Lenora shouted. "Stay down," Duncan roared from outside. She heard the methodical crack of his co-inons. 2, 3 shots, each one placed with surgical calm. Then a horse screaming. Then a man cursing. Then silence. Lenora peered through the ruined window. 2 of Keller's hired men were down, one motionless in the snow, the other crawling toward the tree line, dragging a shattered arm. Sutter had taken cover behind the stone well at the edge of the clearing, exchanging fire with Duncan. Dunbar was still behind the woodpile, bleeding out of the fight. Keller himself had wheeled his black gelding behind the tree line, shouting orders that nobody was left to follow. Duncan broke cover. He moved fast, for a man with a half-healed knife wound, crossing the yard in a low run that drew Sutter's fire. The bullets kicked up snow around his boots. Duncan slid behind the old feed trough, steadied his arm on the frozen wood, and waited. Sutter leaned out from behind the well to aim. Duncan fired once. Sutter dropped his rifle, clutched his chest, and sat down in the snow with a look of faint surprise on his face before toppling sideways. The gunfire stopped. The valley rang with silence and the smell of powder smoke. "Keller!" Duncan shouted toward the trees. "Your men are finished. Come out." No answer. Then the crack of a small-caliber pistol from the tree line, and Duncan flinched as a bullet grazed the top of the feed trough. A Derringer, short range, 2 shots. Keller was desperate. Duncan circled through the trees with the patience of a man who had tracked elk through timber for 20 years. He found Keller backed against a deadfall pine, his Derringer empty, his beaver fur collar torn, his expensive boots caked in mud and snow. The timber baron looked small without his men around him. "It's over, Ambrose." Keller's face twisted. "You think this changes anything? I own the judge. I own the sheriff. I own the recorder's office. You're a dead man with a bag full of papers that nobody in this territory has the authority to act on. The territorial governor disagrees, Duncan said, and the U.S. Marshal in Helena has been expecting my report for 2 weeks. When it doesn't arrive, he'll come looking. And he'll find your men dead in the snow outside a widow's cabin, a widow whose husband you had murdered. Keller's expression shifted from defiance to something looser, more reckless. He turned his head toward the cabin, where Lenora had emerged onto the porch, the Winchester in her hands. Your husband was a fool, Keller spat at her. I offered him a fair price, more than fair. Enough to take you and those brats back east and live comfortable. But he had to play the righteous man, had to talk about principle and legacy. So I had Dunbar fix the cable on the skid line, and I watched that self-righteous idiot ride out to work that morning, knowing he wasn't coming back. The air left Lenora's lungs. She had suspected it. She had felt it in her bones for months. But hearing it spoken aloud, casually, contemptuously, as if Owen's life had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience, something inside her went very quiet. She raised the Winchester. The barrel pointed at Keller's chest. Her hands did not shake. Lenora. Duncan's voice was low, steady. He didn't step between them. He didn't reach for the rifle. He's not worth the weight on your conscience. The rope is coming for him. Let the whole valley watch him swing. Let your children see justice done the right way. Lenora stared at Keller. Tears ran down her cheeks, but her jaw was set like granite. The moment stretched, 5 seconds, 10, an eternity compressed into the space between one heartbeat and the next. She lowered the rifle. Tie him up, she said, her voice scraped hollow, and get him off my land. 3 days later, a U.S. Marshal named Brennan rode into the valley with 4 deputies. Duncan's journal, his maps, and the sworn depositions were placed into federal custody. Ambrose Keller was shackled and loaded onto a prison wagon bound for Helena, along with Clete Dunbar, who would face charges of murder in the death of Owen Breck. Governor Potts dispatched a surveyor team to restore every falsified boundary in the valley. 14 homesteads had their rightful acreage returned. And when the Northern Pacific Railroad's land agent arrived in Darby that spring, he found that the largest stand of old-growth ponderosa pine in the Bitterroot Valley, 40 acres of timber worth a small fortune in rail-tie contracts, belonged legally and irrevocably to one Lenora Breck. She didn't have to sell a single tree. She leased the cutting rights on her terms, at her price, and the first payment alone was more money than Owen had earned in his entire life. Spring broke slowly in the Bitterroot. The snow pulled back from the meadows in patches, revealing dark, wet earth and the first stubborn shoots of bunchgrass. Lenora stood on the new porch, rebuilt with milled lumber paid for in cash, and watched Josie chase a half-grown hound dog through the yard while Micah practiced throwing a lariat at a fence post, missing every time and laughing about it. Duncan Farrow was saddling his horse by the barn. He was heeled now or close to it. A new canvas coat, a fresh survey map rolled behind his saddle, and his satchel packed with blank notebooks for the next assignment. The governor wanted the Flathead Valley mapped before summer. He walked to the porch and stood at the bottom of the steps, hat in his hands. He was not a man built for goodbyes. Well, Mrs. Breck, the passes are clear. The Flathead won't survey itself. Lenora came down one step, then another. She stood close enough to see the new scar on his jaw, where a splinter had caught him during the gunfight, close enough to see the way his hands tightened on the brim of his hat. You could stay, she said. No games, no coyness. The frontier had burned those out of her. There's room. There's work. The children need someone to teach Micah how to throw that lariat before he takes out a window. Duncan looked out at the valley, the peaks still capped in white, the river running fast with snowmelt, the meadows greening at the edges. He looked at Josie and the dog, at Micah, who had stopped throwing the lariat and was watching them with the anxious, hopeful expression of a boy who understood more than he let on. He looked at Lenora. Her steady, unafraid eyes, the calloused hands that had pulled him from the snow and stitched his body back together and held a rifle steady when death came knocking at her door. He put his hat on the porch rail. I reckon, Duncan Farrow said slowly, and a smile spread across his weathered face like the first light of morning breaking over the Sapphire Range. The Flathead Valley has been sitting there for 1,000 years. It can wait a little longer. Lenora smiled, and in the yard below, Mike let out a whoop and threw the lariat so wide it landed on the dog, and Josie fell over laughing, and the sound of it carried across the meadow and up into the mountains, where the snow was melting and the rivers were rising, and the whole vast, stubborn, beautiful territory was waking up into spring.